There is a photograph, small, black and white, taken in the summer of 1975 in a military cemetery in Normandy, France. A man stands before a grave. He is older now, silver-haired, dressed in the quiet way of someone who spent his life teaching children rather than impressing adults. He is not crying. He is simply standing there, head bowed, hands folded in front of him, the way a person stands when they have carried something a long time and finally set it down. The name on the grave reads James A. Calloway, Private First Class, United States Army, 1920 to 1944. The man at the grave is not American. He is not a relative. He is German. And 30 years before that photograph was taken, a Texas soldier stood outside his prison barracks in the middle of the night, rifle in hand, deciding whether to pull the trigger. That soldier did not pull the trigger. What happened instead is the story you are about to hear, and it is not the story you think it is. In the autumn of 1944, the German soldiers being loaded onto transport ships in the ports of liberated France shared one conviction that made the crossing easier to bear. America was weak. They had been told this for years in classrooms, in barracks, in newspapers, in radio broadcasts, in the way that a government tells its people what they need to believe rather than what is actually true. America was a patchwork nation. Immigrants and factory workers and spoiled young men who had never known real hardship. A country built on jazz music and consumer goods, not iron and sacrifice. Compared to the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, American fighting men were amateurs. And the places where those amateurs would keep their prisoners would naturally reflect the nation itself. Temporary, disorganized, possibly cruel in the way that frightened people are cruel. Ernst Vogel was 26 years old. He had been a school teacher in Munich before the war, teaching geography and history to 9-year-olds who asked questions he found genuinely interesting. He was not a fanatic. He was not particularly brave or particularly cowardly. He was a man who had been handed a uniform and a set of beliefs and had done what most men do with both, which is to wear them without examining them too closely. He was captured near Caen in June of 1944, 3 days after the Allied landings. His unit, the 352nd Signal Regiment, had dissolved in the chaos of the invasion, and Ernst found himself alone in a farmhouse kitchen with an empty rifle and the sound of American boots crossing the courtyard. He put his hands up. It was the most rational decision he made in all of June. What he did not tell his captors, what he wrote instead, in a small brown journal he kept hidden inside the lining of his coat, was this. In the autumn of 1943, 6 months before his capture, he had been stationed in central Italy near the ancient hill town of Cassino, where the Wehrmacht had turned a monastery and the mountains around it into a fortress. His unit worked the radio equipment there, intercepting signals, translating intercepts, and relaying coordinates to command. He had done this work dozens of times. It was technical, precise. It kept him away from the front lines, which was the only thing about it he had ever allowed himself to feel grateful for. On the night of November 25, 1943, he translated a set of grid coordinates and passed them through the command frequency. Standard procedure. He did not ask what the coordinates were for. He did not ask how quickly they would be used. He simply did his job and moved on to the next task. He did not learn what happened until months later, when a fragment of information reached him through the informal channels that exist in every war. An American infantry unit had been ambushed near those coordinates that same night. 17 men killed. He sat with that number in the way you sit with something that has no comfortable place to go. 17. He did not pull the trigger, but he had pointed the gun. He wrote in his journal that night. He wrote, "I did not pull the trigger, but I showed the way, and 17 men died. I do not know their names. I do not want to know their names, but I know they had names." He did not sleep well after that. He carried the journal everywhere. It was the only place he could put the weight of it. On the transport ship crossing the Atlantic, Ernst watched his fellow prisoners with the habit of observation that years in a classroom had built into him. The senior officers held small gatherings in the evenings, their voices confident in the brittle way of men who have decided that confidence is the only option left. They reminded each other that American prison conditions would be harsh, that they must maintain discipline, that Germany would not lose. The younger soldiers made jokes about coal mines and forced labor. One man whose name Ernst never learned whispered that he had heard Americans executed German prisoners on the ships to save the cost of feeding them. Ernst listened to all of it. He recorded it, but he also noticed other things that no one else seemed to bother observing. The American sailor sharing a cigarette with the guard on night watch. The way the ship's kitchen distributed rations, not survival portions, but actual meals, enough food, and then a little more. The navigation chart on the wall of the officer's corridor updated daily with small, precise markings that spoke of a logistics operation so large and so careful that no amount of propaganda had prepared him for the scale of it. On the third night of the crossing, Ernst stood alone at the bow railing in the dark. Salt wind, the sound of the ocean, no lights anywhere on the horizon because the convoy ran dark against submarines. And in that darkness, somewhere between the world he had known and whatever was coming next, Ernst Vogel felt something shift in the foundation of everything he had been taught. He did not have a word for it yet. He only knew that the country they were sailing toward was not the one described in any book he had read. He wrote one line in his journal that night and then closed it. He wrote, "Perhaps the most frightening thing is not a powerful enemy. Perhaps it is a correct one." Norfolk, Virginia, September of 1944. The ship docked in the early morning and the prisoners were brought up from below into the flat gray light of an American harbor at sunrise. Ernst stood on the deck and looked at the shore. What he saw was not what propaganda had promised. Cranes lined the docks like iron soldiers 30 meters tall, moving with mechanical certainty. Hundreds of new trucks stood in rows. A warehouse stretched so far along the waterfront that Ernst could not see the end of it. And through the hull of the ship came the sound of industrial machinery, not bombs, not sirens, but the deep, steady hum of a nation producing things at a rate that no one in Germany had told them was possible. He said nothing, but he wrote in his journal that afternoon. He wrote, "They are not afraid. That is the most frightening thing I have seen." The train west took 3 days. 3 days through windows crossed with iron bars, watching a country that no one had described to him accurately. Fields of corn that went to the horizon without interruption. Small towns with white church steeples and gas stations lit up in the middle of the night as if electricity were something you could afford to waste. Children standing at road crossings waving at the train, not because they had been told to, but because they were curious. A country running on its own rhythm, unbothered, vast, and entirely unlike a nation that was supposed to be struggling under the weight of a two-front war. On the second night, Dieter Kranz sat down beside him in the rail car. Kranz was 40 years old, former high school teacher from Dusseldorf, straight-backed and cold-eyed in the way of a man who has decided that certainty is the same thing as strength. He had joined the party in 1933. He had lost 2 sons at Stalingrad. His youngest was missing on the Eastern Front and had been missing for over a year. Kranz looked at Ernst, looking out the window, and said quietly, "What are you watching?" Ernst answered without thinking. He said, "I am learning." Kranz studied him for a moment. Then he stood up and walked away without another word. It was the beginning of something Ernst did not yet have a name for. Camp Hearn, Robertson County, Texas, built in 1942 on flat land in the middle of the state, far enough from both coasts to make escape essentially impossible, and close enough to agricultural communities to make prisoner labor useful to local farms, desperate for workers while their own men were overseas. At its peak, the camp held more than 4,000 German prisoners. The barracks were wooden regulation military standard, clean heated in winter and ventilated in summer. There were showers, a medical facility, a library, 3 meals a day served according to the standards of the Geneva Convention, and in practice somewhat better than that. The first prisoners to arrive in 1942 wrote home describing the place in terms that the censors found so improbable they held the letters for review. One man wrote that the food was better than what he had eaten in the field in Russia. Another wrote that he had been given a book to read. The German High Command, when these letters eventually reached them through neutral channels, chose not to share the information broadly. This was the world that Ernst Vogel entered in September of 1944. Not the nightmare that had been promised. Something stranger and harder to categorize. A reality that did not match the map. Sergeant Ray Calloway was 29 years old. He had been at Camp Hearn since early 1943, signed to the Guard rotation after training at a base in Georgia, and he had stayed because the Army had decided he would stay, and Ray Calloway did not waste energy arguing with decisions that were already made. He was from Abilene, Texas, the oldest of 4 children on a cattle and peanut farm that his father Emmett had worked his whole life, with the stubborn competence of a man who believes that the land owes you nothing and that this is as it should be. Emmett Calloway had taught his oldest son 3 things that he considered essential: how to shoot at 9, how to handle cattle at 12, and how to keep your mouth closed when you had nothing useful to say, which he judged to be most of the time. Ray had learned all 3 and carried them like tools he reached for without thinking. The farm in Abilene smelled of red dust and dry grass and the sweetness of warm cattle in the early morning. On quiet evenings, the sound of crickets in the fields carried all the way to the front porch, where Emmett would sit after dinner without talking, looking at the flat horizon with the expression of a man who had found, over many years, that the horizon asked nothing of him and that this was a reasonable arrangement. Ray grew up with that sound: the crickets at night, the coffee before dawn, the slow movement of cattle through morning fog. These things were not important in any measurable way, but they were the texture of home, and the texture of home is what you feel in your hands when everything else is gone. His brother Jimmy was different in almost every way. Jimmy laughed easily. Jimmy wrote letters that ran to 4 and 5 pages describing everything he saw with the careful attention of someone who understood that the world was worth recording. He had a gift for drawing and sent home pencil sketches tucked inside his letters. Sketches of the farm, the old dog, and later from the Italian front sketches of the hills around Casino that arrived on yellow paper with the pencil lines fading at the edges. He wrote in one of them that the mountains were beautiful in the morning's frost on the stone walls, and that no one should have to die in a place that beautiful, but if you had to die somewhere, at least it was a place worth remembering. The last letter Jimmy wrote was dated November 18, 1943. The notice of his death reached Ray on December 14th. 26 days during which Ray read the letter about the beautiful mountains 3 times and did not know that the person who wrote it was already gone. Ray did not cry when the notice arrived. He folded it into a small rectangle, placed it in the left breast pocket of his uniform, and returned to his post. That was the only thing he knew how to do with it. Keep moving, keep the mouth closed, do the work in front of you. 3 weeks after the new shipment of prisoners arrived from Normandy, Ray sat at the small desk in the records office, going through the intake files. It was standard procedure, routine: name, unit, date of capture, area of operations, military specialty. He went through them the way you go through any paperwork that does not require you to feel anything. He came to the file for Ernst Vogel. He read it. Unit 352nd Signal Regiment. Area of operations in Normandy. And prior to that, the Italian front, October through December of 1943. Ray read that line again. The Italian front, November of 1943. The same front, the same month, the same time frame. It did not mean this man had pulled the trigger. Signal units did not pull triggers. They translated. They transmitted. They moved information from one place to another and let command decide what to do with it. But it meant this man had been there. It meant this man had been working on that front during the weeks that Jimmy had been dying on it. Ray put the file down. He looked through the office window at the yard outside where Ernst Vogel was sitting on a wooden bench reading a discarded newspaper with the quiet focus of a man trying to understand something. Ray did not do anything else that day. He closed the file, stood up, and went back to work. But that night he did not sleep. He lay in his bunk in the dark and listened to the crickets outside the barracks and thought about the distance between knowing a thing and deciding what to do with it. Dieter Kranz did not need an official rank to hold power in the camp. He had something older and more durable than rank. He had the authority of a man who has lost everything and decided that this makes him right. Two sons at Stalingrad, one son missing and presumed dead. 30 years of teaching young Germans that their nation was exceptional and their culture was worth defending. He had given everything to this idea, and the idea was failing, and there was no dignified way to acknowledge that without also acknowledging that his sons had died for nothing. So he did not acknowledge it. He fought instead in the only theater still available to him. His system inside the camp was elegant and almost impossible to attack directly. Every evening he convened what he called a discussion group in the barracks, which in practice was a monitoring session. Who had been seen talking too freely with the American guards? Who had been observed laughing at something an American said? Who had been spotted trying to read an English language publication? Kranz did not beat these men. He did something more effective. He recorded their names. He spoke to the right people in the right order. And when the evidence was sufficient, he wrote formal assessments in careful German and submitted them through the official translation channel to camp administration, recommending that certain prisoners be transferred to more appropriate facilities due to psychological instability and potential escape risk. He had done this 17 times. 16 men had been transferred. What made Kranz dangerous was that he was always procedurally correct. Every report signed, every channel followed, every recommendation phrased in the neutral language of institutional concern rather than personal enmity. The camp commander, a lieutenant colonel named Whitfield, received these reports the way busy men receive paperwork. They have no specific reason to doubt. He signed them. The transfers happened. Ernst Vogel, with his quiet observation and his unreadable expression and his refusal to attend the evening discussions, had been on Kranz's list since the first week. But Ernst had noticed something about Kranz that Kranz did not know anyone had noticed. In the late evenings when the barracks had gone quiet and the other men were sleeping, Kranz would sometimes sit alone near the window and look out at the dark. Not reading, not writing, just sitting. In those moments, the rigid control left his face, and what remained was something Ernst recognized from years of watching parents come to school meetings to talk about children they were about to lose. It was the expression of a man who does not know how to do anything except keep going forward, and who is beginning to understand that forward may not lead anywhere useful. Kranz was not a simple villain. He was a man who had invested everything into something that was falling apart, and the only way to keep the investment from being meaningless was to keep believing in it. The tragedy of him was not his cruelty, it was his consistency. Private Hank Dobbs was 20 years old from Des Moines, Iowa, and had arrived at Camp Hearn in October of 1944, looking slightly too young for his uniform and too earnest for his own comfort. He was tall and tended to look at his boots when he was thinking, which was often. He had a habit of watching things longer than necessary, as if his brain needed extra time to process what his eyes had already seen. He had never met a German before this assignment. In his mind, German and enemy were the same word, and he had no particular reason to draw a distinction. His first night on shared watch with Ray, he asked whether the prisoners were dangerous. Ray looked out at the quiet barracks in the dark and said, "Everything is dangerous if you handle it wrong." Hank did not understand what that meant, but he filed it away in the part of his mind reserved for things he planned to return to later. 3 weeks after arriving, Ernst Vogel was assigned to the kitchen work detail. Washing dishes, peeling potatoes, moving heavy pots between stoves. The work was physically demanding, but it had one advantage that Ernst valued more than the warmth or the shelter. It put him near food, and food had become the clearest lens through which he was learning to see this country. On his first morning in the kitchen, the man running the operation was a corporal from Mississippi named Wilson, a large, cheerful man who dispensed generosity the way some people dispense weather as a fact of the environment, rather than a considered decision. He set a cup of coffee in front of Ernst without comment, then turned back to the stove. Ernst looked at the cup. In Germany, by the later years of the war, real coffee had become a senior officer luxury. What most people drank was a substitute made from roasted barley, a beverage that approximated coffee the way a photograph approximates a person. Ernst had not tasted actual coffee since his mother made it on a winter morning in Munich in 1941, sitting at her small kitchen table before he left for the train station, and the memory of that morning lived in the smell more than in anything else. He raised the cup. The steam came first. It was not the barley smell. It was dark roasted Arabica. The real thing, the smell of his mother's kitchen, the smell of chalk dust and 30 children asking why the sky was blue, the smell of a life that had existed before all of this. He drank one slow sip, set the cup down, closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In the corner of the kitchen, Hank Dobbs was standing his post. He saw all of it, the careful way Ernst lifted the cup, the 2 seconds with his eyes closed, the way Ernst set it down and straightened up and went back to work as if nothing had happened. And something shifted in Hank in that moment, something small and irreversible. He had seen a man drink a cup of coffee. That was all. But in the way that man had drunk it, Hank had seen something he did not expect. Not an enemy, not a prisoner. A person who had been somewhere far away and was trying carefully to find his way back to something recognizable. The night of December 21st, 1944, 3:15 in the morning. Ray Calloway stood outside Barracks 4 in the dark Texas night, carbine in his hands. The cold was not the killing cold of the Italian mountains, as Jimmy had described it, not the cold that got inside your joints and stayed there. It was a Texas winter cold, the kind that bites without committing. His breath came out in small white clouds. The camp was silent. He was not on duty. No one had assigned him to this position. He knew which room Ernst Vogel slept in. Third room on the left, bed against the right wall near the window. He knew because he had checked. He had stood here 2 nights before and left without doing anything. Tonight he had been standing here longer. His right hand held the carbine. His left hand was pressed flat against the left breast pocket of his jacket, where the death notice for Jimmy Calloway had lived since December 14th, folded into a small rectangle, worn soft at the creases from being opened and closed and opened again. He stood in the dark and breathed, not thinking exactly, not feeling exactly. Something between the two and the place where decisions are made before the conscious mind knows they have been made. 30 seconds passed, or 3 minutes. He was not certain. Then Ray Calloway lowered the carbine. He did not lower it because he was a good man. He did not lower it because he had found forgiveness. He lowered it because in that moment he looked at his own hands in the darkness and remembered something his father had said to him when he was 15 years old, standing over a fence post he had driven in crooked and wanted to correct with a sledgehammer. Emmett Calloway had taken the hammer from his hand and said, "A gun solves the problem outside you. It does not solve the problem inside you. Figure out which problem you actually have." Ray had been 15. He had not understood it then. He understood it now. He turned and walked back toward the guard post. His boots on the dry Texas ground made the only sound in the camp. The crickets had gone quiet for the winter. The sky was absolutely clear, the kind of clear you only get far from cities, the Milky Way visible as a smear of light from horizon to horizon. At the corner of the kitchen building, Hank Dobbs stood his watch. He had seen Ray walking toward the barracks. He had seen Ray stop. He had stood very still in his post and watched a man stand in the dark for a long time holding a rifle. He had watched the man lower it. He had watched the man walk away. He did not understand what had happened, but he felt in his chest, in the same place where the coffee had landed, that whatever he had just witnessed was something he would not forget. Inside Barracks 4, Ernst Vogel lay awake on his bunk. The small brown journal was open on his chest. The pencil was in his hand. He had not written anything yet tonight. He was thinking about the train ride across America and the children waving from the road crossings, and the sound the industrial machinery made in the Norfolk Harbor, the deep, patient hum of something that had no intention of stopping. He wrote one line and then closed the journal and pressed it to his chest in the dark. He wrote, "I cannot sleep. I do not understand this country, And what I do not understand has begun to frighten me more than what I thought I knew. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and still. The man who had been standing in the dark outside his window was already gone. Ernst did not know he had been there. He did not know that 30 feet away, while he was writing in his journal about the weight of not understanding a man named Ray Calloway, had made a decision that neither of them would speak out loud for a very long time. But somewhere in the way that things that matter find each other, eventually the two men had already begun. February came to Robertson County the way it always did, without ceremony, the cold thinning slightly at the edges but not yet willing to let go. The fields around Camp Hearn sat pale and quiet under skies the color of old pewter. The cattle on the farms outside the wire moved slowly through the morning frost breath, rising off their backs in thin columns. Inside the camp, the rhythm of captivity had settled into something almost ordinary. Reveille, roll call, work assignments, meals. The men of Barracks 4 had learned the shape of their days the way you learn the layout of a room you are locked inside. Not with comfort exactly, but with the adaptation of people who have concluded that adjusting is the only reasonable response to a situation they cannot change. Ernst Vogel had adapted better than most, not because he was more resilient, but because he had brought with him a habit that proved useful inside wire fences. He had always been a careful observer, and there was no shortage of things to observe. He had been watching the American Guards for 4 months now, not studying them for weakness or opportunity in the way that Kranz encouraged during the evening sessions. Watching them the way he had watched his students in Munich, looking for the thing beneath the surface behavior, the thing that explained why a person acted as they did. He had noticed that the guards who treated prisoners worst were generally the youngest ones, the 18 and 19-year-olds, who were performing toughness for the benefit of their peers. The older guards, the men in their late 20s and 30s, tended toward a different mode. Not kindness exactly, more like professional distance, a willingness to let things be ordinary when ordinary was available. Ray Calloway was the clearest example of this. He ran his shift with an economy of communication that Ernst found almost admirable. Clear instructions, no cruelty, no particular warmth. A man doing a job the way a craftsman does attending to the work itself rather than to the impression it creates. Ernst had watched him for months without ever speaking more than functional sentences in his direction. And yet he had the distinct sense that Ray Calloway was watching him back in the same careful way for reasons he could not yet identify. He did not know about the personnel file. He did not know about the night outside the barracks. He did not know that the man who oversaw his days had a name folded in his breast pocket that connected them in a way neither had chosen. In February of 1945, the agricultural labor program at Camp Hearn expanded. The farms surrounding the camp had been running short-handed for 2 years. The men who should have been planting and harvesting and repairing fences were in France and the Pacific and the Philippines. Women and older men had absorbed as much of the work as they physically could, and it was not enough. The Army had a practical solution. Prisoner labor details supervised by guards contracted to local farms within a 15-mile radius. The prisoners received a nominal wage paid in camp currency. The farmers received labor they could not otherwise find. Everyone made an accommodation that the situation required. Sergeant Ray Calloway was assigned to supervise the detail going to the Pemberton farm, 5 miles north of the camp. He read the work order, noted the location, and began organizing the 10-man group. He went through the labor assignment list the way he went through everything methodically without comment until he reached the name Ernst Vogel and stopped for exactly 1 beat. Then he folded the list, put it in his pocket, and went to prepare the truck. Hank Dobbs rode in the cab with Ray. The 10 prisoners rode in the open bed behind hands visible, no restraints, the flat Texas winter passing on both sides as they drove north on the farm road. In the truck bed, Ernst sat with his back against the cab wall and watched the landscape. The fields here were different from the Italian hills. No stone walls, no elevation. Just flat open land in every direction, sky above, and soil below, the geometry of a place that had never felt the need to hide itself. He found it both disorienting and strangely honest. The land kept nothing back. It simply was what it was. Eleanor Pemberton did not come out when the truck pulled through her gate. The truck stopped in the yard beside the barn, and Ray climbed down, and the prisoners came out of the bed one by one and stood in a loose group, and for 2 full minutes there was no one to receive them except the farm itself. A water tower, a hay barn with one side wall leaning at a worrying angle, a corral with 3 horses who looked at the new arrivals with the professional disinterest of animals who have seen too much to be startled. Then Eleanor came around the corner of the barn, wiping her hands on her work apron. 48 years old, brown hair cut practically short, the kind of face that has been outdoors in every season for decades and wears it directly, no apology. She looked at the 10 men standing in her yard the way she might look at a piece of equipment delivered by the farm supply store, evaluating whether it was what she had ordered and whether it would do what she needed done. She said to Ray that she needed 300 meters of east fence, repair the drainage ditch behind the equipment, shed cleared and the calf pen mucked out and re-strawed. She asked whether they could manage that. Ray told her they could. She nodded, went inside, came back 5 minutes later with a large pot of coffee and 10 tin cups that she set on the porch railing without fanfare, then went back inside again. The men looked at the coffee, then at Ray. Ray nodded once they moved toward the porch. Ernst wrapped both hands around a cup and stood in the thin February sun and drank. The coffee was strong and real, and it tasted like the same thing the kitchen corporal Wilson had given him on his first morning in the camp kitchen, that deep, familiar warmth moving down through the chest. Around him, the farm sat quietly in the morning. A rooster called from somewhere behind the equipment shed. One of the horses in the corral blew out through its nose in the way horses express mild opinion. The sky was enormous and clear and completely indifferent to everything happening beneath it. Ernst had grown up near Munich, where the landscape was defined by hills and forests and the particular enclosed feeling of mountains in the distance. He had lived his whole life in a world where the horizon was always interrupted by something. Here, standing in Eleanor Pemberton's yard, with a cup of coffee in both hands, the horizon went all the way around without interruption. It should have felt exposed. Instead, it felt like a kind of honesty he had not expected from a country he had been taught to distrust. They worked through the morning in near silence. Ernst was assigned to the fence line on the east boundary, paired with 2 other men he knew only by their barrack numbers. The fence posts were cedar, most of them solid, but a section of perhaps 50 meters had been undermined by water and needed new posts driven. The ground was hard, but not impossible. Ernst worked steadily, not hurrying, not resting more than necessary, and found in the physical work a kind of quiet that was different from the quiet of captivity. Outside the wire, with the flat land around him and the sound of the wind through the dry grass, the dimensions of his situation briefly changed. He was not a prisoner digging. He was simply a man working in a field. These were not the same thing, even if they looked identical from a distance. Ray moved between the work groups throughout the morning, checking progress, correcting technique, speaking when necessary. When he came to the fence line where Ernst was working, he stopped and watched for a moment, then said that the post needed to go 2 inches deeper for the soil type. Ernst drove it deeper. Ray moved on. Nothing more. But Hank Dobbs, watching from 20 meters away, noticed that Ray stood a little longer at Ernst's section of fence than at any other. Stood and watched with the careful stillness of a man who was trying to read something written in a language he only partially knows. At noon, Eleanor brought out a board of bread she had baked that morning. White bread, dense and faintly sweet, still warm enough in the center to feel it through the crust. She set it on the tailgate of the truck with a jar of butter and said nothing, then went back to her own work. The men gathered around the tailgate and ate standing up, and the bread was so simply good, so plainly what it was, that the eating of it was briefly the only thing that mattered. Ernst tore a piece slowly and pressed it between his fingers before he ate it. The softness, the warm yeast smell. His mother baked bread on Friday afternoons in Munich. The smell of the kitchen on those Friday afternoons was one of the things he had not known he was carrying until this particular piece of bread on this particular tailgate in Robertson County, Texas, released it all at once. He looked up and saw Eleanor Pemberton standing in the doorway of the farmhouse watching him. He had not realized she was there. He looked at the bread in his hands and then back at her and said slowly and carefully in English he had been teaching himself from discarded newspapers that the bread was homemade. He asked whether she had made it herself. She said yes. Every week. He nodded, looked at the bread again, said quietly almost to himself that at home his mother made bread on Fridays. Eleanor said nothing, but she held his gaze for a moment before she went back inside, and there was something in that pause that was neither warm nor cold. It was the look of a woman who had been trained by loss to pay attention to the details that other people overlook. Hank Dobbs was watching this too. He was watching most things standing off to one side as he usually did, filing away images he did not yet have the context to interpret. He had been keeping a kind of informal inventory in his head since the first night on watch with Ray. Small moments that did not fit his original categories. A German man drinking coffee with his eyes closed. The same man asking about bread. Ray standing longer than necessary at a fence line. He did not know what the inventory would eventually add up to. He only knew it was accumulating. 3 weeks into the farm details schedule, Dieter Kranz moved. He had been watching Ernst with the focused patience of a man who understands that evidence collected slowly is evidence that holds. The indications were modest individually, but significant in aggregate. Ernst attended the evening discussion sessions less and less frequently, offering work fatigue as explanation, which was plausible but not convincing. He had been observed reading an English-language newspaper that a guard had left on a bench in the yard, not just looking at the photographs, but reading the text, following the words with his finger in the way of someone actively learning. And there was something else harder to quantify but impossible for Kranz to ignore. A quality in Ernst's bearing since the farm detail assignments began. Not friendliness toward the Americans exactly, but a kind of attention to the world around him that looked from the outside like the beginning of engagement, like a man starting to believe that the world he was in was real rather than temporary. For Kranz, this was not a neutral observation. It was a betrayal in its early form before it had committed to itself. He wrote the assignment in careful German, formal language, institutional phrasing. He described a prisoner displaying signs of psychological disorientation and possibly unsound loyalty to the German national interest. He noted repeated absences from unit cohesion activities. He recommended evaluation and potential transfer to a facility better equipped to address the prisoner's particular needs. He submitted the report through the official translation channel to camp administration the same way he had submitted 16 previous reports over 7 months. He did not sign it as a personal complaint. He signed it as a concern of duty. In the administration office, the translated report landed in a processing tray. A clerk stamped it, received, and placed it in the queue for the guard sergeant responsible for the prisoner in question, which was Ray Calloway. The report reached Ray's desk on a Tuesday morning in late February, along with 11 other routine pieces of paperwork, and Ray read it the way he read everything steadily without visible reaction. He read it again. He set it in the tray labeled pending action. He did not touch it again that day. That Friday, the farm detail truck was pulling out of the Pemberton property at 4 in the afternoon when it happened. The kind of thing that has no drama to it until later when you understand what it meant. Ernst was the last man up into the truck bed, climbing over the tailgate, and his boot caught the edge, and he stumbled forward and hit the side of the cab with his shoulder. The small brown journal, which he kept inside the lining of his work coat, worked free of the inner pocket in the impact, and fell through the gap in the coat front, hit the truck bed, bounced once, and fell out over the tailgate onto the gravel of the farm road. Ray was standing 3 feet away. He picked it up before Ernst had finished steadying himself, looked at it. A small notebook, brown cloth cover, worn soft at the corners, the kind you could buy in any European stationery shop before the war. He turned it over in his hands. Ernst reached down from the truck bed and held out his hand. Ray looked at the journal, then he looked at Ernst. Something passed between them in that moment that neither of them acknowledged, the charged silence of 2 people who were both aware that a decision is being made. Camp regulations permitted guards to confiscate undeclared personal items. The journal had not been declared. Ray had every procedural right to take it. He could have taken it for security reasons alone, without any of the other reasons that were present in his chest at that moment. The cold, specific reasons with a name and a date and a hillside in Italy attached to them. He said nothing. He put the journal in his jacket pocket and turned to check the other men loading up. Ernst watched him do it. He lowered his hand, said nothing, got in the truck. Hank Dobbs in the Cherry glanced in the side mirrors and saw the whole thing. He did not say anything either. He faced forward and watched the road as they drove back to camp, and in the growing dark of the late February afternoon, he turned to something over in his mind that he could not quite resolve, the sense that what he had just seen was either very ordinary or very important, and that he would not know which for some time. That night, Ray sat at the small desk in his room in the guards' quarters with the journal open in front of him under the weak yellow desk lamp. He could read some German, not fluently. His grandmother had come from Stuttgart and had spoken German in the house until Ray was 10 years old, which gave him the ability to follow simple written sentences and catch key words even when the grammar eluded him. He could read dates. He could read place names. He could read numbers. He found the entry for November of 1943 easily because he knew what he was looking for. Casino. He found that word on the page the way you find a word when you have been dreading it, not searching so much as bracing. He called the translation duty sergeant, a Wisconsin man named Kowalski, whose German was fluent, and asked him to read 3 specific passages. He did not tell Kowalski why. He just sat across the desk and watched the man's face as he read. Kowalski read the first passage, then stopped. He looked up at Ray and then back down at the page. He read it again more slowly and then translated it in the flat professional voice of someone who has decided that accurate delivery is more important than emotional management. He translated it this way. November 25th, 1943. I translated the coordinates and passed them through the command frequency. I did not know they would be used immediately. I did not know how many men were there. I did not pull the trigger, but I showed the way, and 17 men died. I do not know their names. I do not want to know their names, but I know they had names. Ray said nothing. Kowalski read the second passage, which came from several months later, when Ernst had apparently obtained a fragment of newspaper. He translated it this way. I found a partial casualty list today. I read each name. Callaway James A., Private First Class, Abilene, Texas. He was 24 years old. I have taught students who were 24 years old. They are still too young to understand that the world is not always explicable. He will never know that, and I must go on knowing that I was part of the reason he cannot know it. The room was very quiet. Kowalski set the journal down on the desk. He looked at Ray. He asked whether he needed to file a formal report. Ray sat still for a long time. Then he said no. He thanked Kowalski and told him he could go. He sat alone in the room after that for a period he could not afterward measure. The journal was on the desk in front of him. Outside the window, the Texas night was fully dark, the kind of dark that is only available far from city lights, and the stars were extraordinary. The Milky Way laid out from one edge of the sky to the other, with the extravagant indifference of something that has existed for longer than the concept of war. 17 men. Jimmy was one of 17. And the man who had relayed the information that sent those 17 men into an ambush had also later found Jimmy's name in a newspaper and written it down. Not to excuse himself, not to perform guilt for an audience. He had written it because he was alone with it, and the only place he had to put it was the page. Ray picked up the journal, held it, looked at the worn brown cover for a long time. Then he placed it on the right side of his desk instead of the left. The left side was for things to be returned. The right side was for things to be held. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in his bunk with his eyes open and listened to the dark and thought about the distance between a man who pulls a trigger and a man who passes coordinates, whether that distance was meaningful or whether it was only comfortable to believe that it was, and what it said about him, that he was still working out the answer. The Kranz report sat in the pending tray on his desk. He did not touch it the next day either. The following week, on a Thursday afternoon at the Pemberton farm, Eleanor was in the farmhouse kitchen when she heard the screen door and turned to find Ernst standing in the doorway. He had been sent in by Ray to locate a pipe wrench for the waterline repair in the equipment shed, the same pipe wrench Eleanor kept in the cabinet under the kitchen sink because that was where it lived and she saw no reason to move it. He found it easily enough, but before he turned to go, he noticed something on the kitchen counter, a small glass jar. Inside it, preserved in the amber suspension of home canning, were peaches. He stopped. He looked at the jar. Peaches in syrup bright against the winter outside the window. The color of an August afternoon preserved against February. Eleanor came in from the back room and found him looking at the jar. She did not say anything at first, just watched him look at it. He said slowly that he had not seen preserved peaches since before the war, that his grandmother kept a shelf of them in her cellar in Bavaria, different fruits through the seasons, and that the peaches were the ones she opened first in winter. Eleanor set the jar on the table and found two small bowls and opened it, and they ate standing at the kitchen counter, without discussion, the peaches sweet and cool and tasting of summer, in a way that had nothing to do with the year or the country or the particular circumstances of how they had come to stand in the same kitchen. After they finished, she said quietly that her son had liked them too, that she had been putting them up every fall since he was small. Ernst looked at her. He waited. She said that Thomas had been killed at Guadalcanal in October of 1942, that he was 22 years old, that she had received the notification while she was in the middle of putting up the fall preserves, and that she had finished the work before she allowed herself to stop because the work needed to be done, and stopping would not bring him back, and she had decided somewhere in the process of sealing the last jar that continuing was the only available form of dignity. Ernst said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it, and know that meaning it is the only thing they have to offer. Eleanor looked at him carefully. She said he said that like a man with a reason to say it. He did not respond to that. She did not push. But something shifted in the space between them. The shift that occurs when two people who have been careful with each other recognize without stating it that carefulness may no longer be necessary. The Kranz report had been sitting in Ray's pending tray for 2 weeks when it was followed by a second document. This one came from the Internal Security Office rather than through Kranz directly. It informed Sergeant Calloway that a procedural review had been initiated regarding an unprocessed transfer recommendation for a prisoner in his charge and requested a written explanation for the delay. Ray read the second document. He looked at the first one. He picked up his pen. He held it over the signature line on the transfer order for Ernst Vogel. Camp Trinidad, Colorado. He knew the name. He had heard it mentioned in a way that communicated everything about what kind of place it was and what happened to the people who went there. He held the pen. He thought about 17 men in a hillside in a small brown journal that was currently sitting on the right side of his desk. He thought about the distance between pulling a trigger and pointing a direction. He thought about what Jimmy would have said because Jimmy always had a way of reducing complicated things to their actual shape without losing any of their complexity, which was a gift Ray had never adequately understood until it was no longer available to him. He put the pen down. He did not sign. He did not file an explanation either. He placed both documents in the pending tray and stood up and went back to work, and he spent the rest of that afternoon in the internal weather of a man who has made a non-decision and knows that a non-decision is still a choice and that the choice is about to come back to him with interest. Hank Dobbs was in the corridor outside the records office when Ray came out. He had not been listening. He had simply been there, as he often was, in the peripheral position that seemed to be his natural habitat. He saw Ray's face as he came through the door, not angry, not relieved, the face of a man who has stood at the edge of something and stepped back and is still working out whether stepping back was the right thing or whether it was just the easier thing. Hank said nothing. He fell into step a few paces behind as Ray walked toward the yard. That evening, in the last light of a February afternoon with the cold coming back in from the north, Ernst sat on the wooden bench in the yard where he had been sitting for months, with whatever reading material was available, and he looked at the sky the way he had been looking at Texas skies since September, with the concentrated attention of a man trying to understand something by looking at it long enough. The colors in the west were extraordinary. Rose and copper and a thin line of pale green along the horizon where the warmth had last been. He did not know about the transfer order. He did not know that his name had been written on a document with a destination attached to it. He did not know that a man named Ray Calloway had held a pen over that document and put it down. He only knew that the sky was remarkable, and that tomorrow there would be work, and that somewhere in Munich, if she was still alive, his mother was looking at a different sky, and that the distance between her sky and his was the same distance it had always been. It was only the meaning of that distance that had changed. Inside the barracks, Dieter Kranz was writing a third report. This one went to a different office. This one was not about Ernst Vogel. This one was about Ray Calloway. And the language was careful and formal and entirely correct in every procedural detail. And it noted that an American Guard sergeant had been in possession of an undeclared prisoner document for a period exceeding 2 weeks without filing the required report, and that a transfer recommendation had been submitted through proper channels and had not been actioned within the required time frame, and that these two facts in combination suggested a pattern of improper conduct that warranted formal investigation. Kranz was not wrong about the facts. He was only wrong about what the facts meant. But that was a distinction that would take time to establish, and time was something that Kranz understood better than most. He had been patient for months. He could be patient for a little longer. The pen moved across the page. The report took shape. The camp hummed around him in the February dark, and at the far end of the yard, a young man from Iowa stood his watch and looked up at a sky full of more stars than he had ever seen in Des Moines, and did not yet know that the story he was standing in the middle of was one he would spend the rest of his life trying to find adequate words for. March came in warm that year, warmer than usual, the way Texas sometimes reminds you that winter was only ever a visitor and never intended to stay. The peach trees on the east side of Eleanor Pemberton's property put out blossoms 2 weeks early. The fields softened. The light changed from the flat gray of February to something with actual color in it, the particular gold of late afternoon spreading northward into Robertson County and making everything it touched look briefly like it had been chosen. Eleanor Pemberton found the letter on a Sunday morning. She had not been looking for it. She had been going through the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in Thomas's room, a task she had started and stopped 4 times since his death, never quite finding the capacity to reach the bottom of it. On this particular Sunday, she got further than she had before, past the folded uniform, past the photograph from his graduation at the Marine Training Facility, the one where he was squinting against the sun and smiling the way he smiled when he was trying not to look too pleased with himself, past the small collection of arrowheads he had found in the creek bed as a boy and saved in a tobacco tin, and then near the bottom an envelope she did not recognize. Inside it, a letter in Thomas's handwriting, dated September of 1942, 1 month before Guadalcanal. She sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet Sunday house and read it. It was a long letter, several pages. He wrote about the heat and the insects and the quality of the canned food and the way the other men in his unit played cards at night to pass the time. He wrote about missing the farm and the horses and her cooking. He wrote about the smell of rain on dry ground that he had been thinking about for weeks. And then near the end, almost as an afterthought, he wrote about something that had happened on patrol the week before. He had come across a Japanese soldier in a clearing, wounded, unable to move. The soldier looked up at him. Thomas had his rifle. The soldier had no weapon he could reach. They looked at each other for what Thomas described as a very long time, though he suspected it was only a few seconds. He did not fire. He moved on. He did not report the encounter. He had been thinking about it ever since. He wrote that he did not know whether what he had done was right or wrong by any measurable standard, whether it was mercy or tactical error, or simply hesitation dressed up in retrospect as a principle. But he wrote that in the moment itself, looking at the man in the clearing, he had seen a person before he saw an enemy. And he wrote that he hoped if the positions had been reversed, the other man would have done the same. He wrote at the very end of the letter, "This is not about enemies. This is about people. I think those are different categories, and I think we forget that too easily when it costs us something to remember." Eleanor folded the letter back into the envelope. She sat with it in her hands for a while. Then she put it in the pocket of her work apron and went downstairs and made coffee and stood in the kitchen looking out at the peach trees in bloom. She thought about Thomas and the man in the clearing. She thought about the German men who came to her farm 3 days a week and worked her fence lines and drank her coffee and ate her bread. She thought about Ernst Vogel standing at her kitchen counter, eating preserved peaches in February, saying his grandmother kept a shelf of them in her cellar in Bavaria. She thought about the look on Ray Calloway's face when he climbed down from the truck each morning, the look of a man carrying something that had no appropriate place to be set down. She was still standing at the window when she heard the truck come through the gate. That afternoon, after the work detail had finished and the other prisoners had loaded up and Hank was waiting in the cab, Eleanor called Ray over to the porch. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set the letter on the table between them. She did not explain. She just read the last 2 paragraphs. Ray read them. He read them again. He set the letter down on the table and looked out at the yard where the horses stood in the late afternoon light. Eleanor picked the letter up and held it against her chest and said that her boy had been 22 years old, that he had been 3 weeks away from Guadalcanal when he wrote it, that he had never talked about any of it in the letters after, and she had never found out what happened to the man in the clearing. She said she was not telling Ray to instruct him or judge him or tell him what to do about anything. She said she was telling him because Thomas had stood in a moment very much like the one Ray was standing in, and he had chosen a specific thing, and he had lived the remaining weeks of his life inside that choice. And she had always believed, though she had no way to verify it, that he had died at peace with it. Ray did not say anything for a long time. Then he picked up his coffee cup. He drank it. He set it down. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton." He stood up and walked back to the truck. Hank Dobbs watched him come across the yard and climb into the cab and start the engine. He did not ask what they had talked about. He could read enough in Ray's face to know that asking was unnecessary and that whatever had happened on that porch was going to take time to settle into something speakable. They drove back to camp in the last light of the afternoon, the road turning orange and then red under the setting sun, the flat land opening out on both sides into the enormous quiet of early Texas spring. It was Hank who told Ernst. He had not planned to. He was not in the habit of inserting himself into situations he only partially understood, and he understood this one less than most. But on a morning in late March, while the other prisoners were loading tools into the equipment shed, and Ray was talking to Eleanor about the irrigation schedule for the coming season, Hank found himself standing near Ernst at the fence line, and the thing that had been accumulating in him since December simply tipped over its own edge. He said it quietly, and in the halting German he had been teaching himself from a pocket phrase book and a willingness to be wrong. He said that Sergeant Calloway had read the journal. He said that Ernst should know. Ernst did not move. He was looking at the fence post he had been checking for rot, and he kept looking at it for a moment, and then he turned slowly and looked at Hank. He asked in English whether Calloway had read all of it. Hank said yes. Ernst looked back at the fence post. His hands were still. After a while, he said thank you in English quietly and with the kind of precision that told Hank it was not a reflexive phrase. He meant it the way you mean something when it matters. Hank walked back toward the equipment shed. He did not look back, but he felt as he walked that something he had been holding carefully for months had just been handed to the right person, and that the handing of it was the correct thing regardless of what happened next. Ernst waited 2 days. He wanted to be sure of what he was going to say and how he was going to say it, because this was not a conversation that could be backed out of once started, and he had spent enough of his life saying things imprecisely to understand the cost of imprecision in moments that required the opposite. On a Wednesday morning at the Pemberton farm during the midday break, when the other prisoners had moved to the shade of the hay barn and Hank was near the equipment shed, Ernst walked across the yard to where Ray was standing alone by the east fence, drinking water from a canteen and looking at the tree line in the distance. He stopped 3 paces away. He waited until Ray looked at him. Then he spoke. He said he knew that Calloway had read the journal. He said he was not there to explain himself or to ask for anything. He said he only wanted Ray to know one thing, that the name Calloway James A. from Abilene, Texas was not just a name he had come across and noted and moved past. He said that he had carried that name in his chest since the day he found it in the newspaper fragment, and that he had written it down because there was no other way to hold it that felt honest. Ray looked at him without speaking. Ernst said he did not pull the trigger, but he said this not as a defense. He said it the way a man states a fact that does not actually resolve anything, because he had lived long enough inside the fact to know that not pulling the trigger and not being responsible were not the same thing, and that the distance between them was exactly the size of the thing he had been carrying. The two men stood at the east fence in the March morning, with the peach trees flowering 20 meters away, and the horses moving slowly in the corral, and the enormous Texas sky overhead doing what the Texas sky always does, which is to be present and vast and entirely unconcerned with the specific weight of what is happening beneath it. Ray said after a long time that he wanted to ask Ernst something. He said he wanted to know what Ernst did after he translated the coordinates, whether he went to sleep, whether he ate dinner, whether the night felt different from any other night. Ernst considered this. He said that he had eaten dinner, that the night had felt ordinary, that he had not known what those coordinates would become until much later, and that this was the part he found hardest to live with. Not that he had done something knowingly terrible, but that he had done something terrible in the ordinary course of a working evening between dinner and sleep without it registering as anything other than routine. He said he thought that was the actual nature of most of the damage the world contained. Not monsters deciding to do monstrous things, ordinary people doing ordinary tasks that happen to be monstrous and not finding out until afterward, if they found out at all. Ray looked at him. Then he looked back at the tree line. He said nothing for a while. Then he said that Jimmy would have found that an interesting observation. He said his brother had a way of seeing the shape of things that most people could not get to. Ernst asked whether Jimmy had been like Ray. Ray said no. He said Jimmy had been better at being alive than Ray ever was, more present, more curious, more willing to be surprised by things. Ernst said that was worth knowing about a person. Ray said yes, it was. That was all they said. Ernst turned and walked back to the hay barn. Ray finished his water and put the canteen away and went back to checking the fence line. Hank Dobbs, from a distance that was far enough to be correct and close enough to see, watched the two men separate and go back to their respective tasks, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for, but that felt in its texture like the resolution of a cord that had been suspended for a long time. On the 12th of April, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. The news came through the camp radio in the afternoon and moved outward from the administration building in waves, one person to the next, the information carried in the face of the person delivering it as much as in the words. American soldiers stopped what they were doing. Some sat down. A young private named Coleman, who had been assigned to Camp Hearn straight out of training and had never been to the front, sat on the steps of the supply building and put his face in his hands. In Barracks 4, the German prisoners received the news with a variety of responses. Some men said nothing and showed nothing. A few of the younger ones exchanged glances that communicated private satisfaction in a way they did not want to make public. Dieter Kranz heard the announcement and went to his bunk and sat with his hands on his knees and did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. Ernst Vogel heard it and then thought about the country he had watched from a train window in September, the children waving from the road crossings, the gas stations lit in the dark, and felt something complicated that he could not immediately name. What Kranz did that evening is this. He requested a formal meeting with the camp translation officer. He presented his third report, the one about Ray Calloway. He noted in the careful language of institutional procedure that the matter had become more urgent given the administrative disruptions of the day. He submitted the report with a covering letter requesting expedited review. And he said in the meeting that he believed the situation represented a pattern of conduct that merited formal investigation and that he was prepared to provide additional testimony if required. The translation officer, a lieutenant named Barrett, who had been at Camp Hearn for 6 months and had developed a working familiarity with the internal dynamics of the prisoner population, received the report and said he would forward it as appropriate. He did not tell Kranz that he had also received the previous week a separate inquiry from a different guard sergeant about a pattern of prisoner transfer recommendations that appeared to be coordinated rather than independent. He filed both documents and waited to see which one resolved into something actionable first. That same evening, Kranz convened the discussion session in Barracks 4, as he always had or tried to. The men drifted in with less certainty than before, the air in the room carrying the flatness of a group that has begun to sense its center is not holding. Kranz opened by noting in his formal way the names of 3 men who had been observed in recent days engaging too freely with American personnel. Ernst Vogel's name was the first. Ernst stood up. He did not raise his voice. He had spent years in front of children who needed clarity more than volume, and the habit held. He said in the measured German of a man who had chosen every word before speaking any of them that Dieter Kranz had filed 17 reports through the camp administration over the preceding 7 months. He said that 16 men had been transferred right on the basis of those reports. He said he had spoken to 3 of them before they left and that none of the 3 had displayed any of the behaviors described. He said that what Kranz was doing was not maintaining German dignity. It was using the tools of the very system they had all been told to resist against the men he disagreed with, and that the irony of this was precise and ought to be named plainly. The room was silent. Kranz looked at him. Something happened in his face in that moment, something that Ernst had not seen there before and would not see there again. Not anger, not contempt, something closer to recognition. The expression of a man who has just seen for the first time what he looks like from the outside. He did not respond. He ended the session and told the men to return to their bunks. He never held another. Ray received formal notification of the pending investigation the following morning. He read it at his desk. He read it twice. He set it down and looked out the window at the yard where the morning roll call was proceeding normally. 800 men lined up in the flat spring light, Kranz standing perfectly straight at the head of his barrack group, as he always did, as if the posture itself were an argument. Ray had 3 days to respond to the investigation notification before it escalated to the next level of command. He spent the first day doing nothing. The second day, he went to the records office and pulled the files for all 17 transfer recommendations Kranz had submitted over 7 months. He read each one carefully. He made notes. He organized what he found into a sequence that showed not just the individual reports, but the pattern running through them, the way each one arrived after a specific prisoner had been observed behaving in a way that diverged from Kranz's definition of acceptable loyalty. He wrote it out by hand at the desk in his room between 10 at night and 2 in the morning, not asking for help, not telling anyone what he was doing. On the morning of April 23rd, he carried the folder into Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield's office. Whitfield was a career officer in his late 50s who had spent the war in administrative commands and had developed through long practice the ability to receive complex information without showing what he made of it until he had made something of it. He read Ray's folder. He read the transfer recommendations. He read Ray's analysis of the pattern. He looked up and asked Ray whether he understood that proceeding with this would create complications for him personally, given that his own conduct was under review. Ray said, "Yes, sir." He understood that. Whitfield looked at him for a while with the expression of a man deciding whether to trust an intuition. Then he asked whether Ray believed the transfers had been procedurally improper. Ray said he believed they had been procedurally correct and substantively improper, and that the difference mattered. Whitfield looked at the folder again. He called his aide and asked for the transfer files on the 16 prisoners who had been moved out of Camp Hearn under Kranz's recommendations over the preceding 7 months. He told Ray to sit down and wait. The review took 4 days. At the end of it, Whitfield signed an order placing a hold on the pending transfer of Ernst Vogel, pending internal review of the recommendation process. He simultaneously forwarded Ray's analysis to the military police liaison at the district level with a request for a formal assessment of the transfer recommendation pattern. The investigation of Dieter Kranz began quietly without announcement, the way institutional investigations begin. A meeting here, a document, request there, the machinery of accountability moving at its own pace, unhurried and impersonal. Kranz found out through the informal intelligence network that exists in every closed community. He found out on a Tuesday evening, and he sat for a long time on his bunk after lights out in the quiet that had replaced the evening discussion sessions that he was no longer permitted to hold. He sat in the dark and thought about Stalingrad and his sons in the country that had asked for everything and was now asking him to account for how he had spent what was left. He did not capitulate. He would not have known how. But in the silence of Barracks 4, in the Texas spring night, something in him stopped, pressing forward for the first time in years. Not defeat exactly, more like the exhaustion of a man who has finally run out of wall to push against. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The news came in the early morning, and by midday it had moved through every corner of Camp Hearn in both directions, through the American guards and through the prisoner population carrying different weight with different people. For some of the Americans, it was a cause for genuine joy. For others, including Ray, it was a quieter thing, the mixture of relief and grief that belongs to men who have lost someone and find in the ending of a war not a celebration but a hard final accounting. For the German prisoners, the response was even more complex. Some men wept, some stared at nothing. A few of the hardliners refused to accept it, insisting that the reports were propaganda. Kranz said nothing at all for 2 full days. He sat at his bunk and looked at the wall, and no one disturbed him. Ernst Vogel heard the news while he was working in the kitchen, and he set down the pot he was holding and stood still for a moment. He thought about Munich, about whether there was anything left of it, about his mother and whether she had made it through the bombing, about the school building on Leopoldstrasse and whether it still had walls, about what it would mean to go back to a place that no longer matched the place he had carried in his memory for the preceding years. He picked up the pot and went back to work. There was no other reasonable response. Eleanor Pemberton organized a barbecue at the farm for the second weekend of May. She did it the way she did everything, without particular announcement, by starting the preparations and letting the doing of them communicate the intention. She sent word to Ray that the detail was welcome to stay past work hours if the camp could arrange it. Ray arranged it. The old drum smoker that Eleanor's husband had built from an oil barrel in 1929 and that had cooked enough brisket over 16 years to feed a small town sat in the side yard and was started before sunrise. By mid-morning, the smoke was going properly, hickory and a little oak, and the smell of it moved out across the farm and down the road and into the fields beyond the fence line in the way that wood smoke over meat travels low and persistent, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and your hair and stays there, and that you find yourself thinking about days later. The prisoners arrived at 7 in the morning and worked until noon. At noon, Eleanor brought out the meat. Brisket sliced thick still, smoking from the cooker. Pinto beans from the pot on the stove. Cornbread in a cast iron pan. Sweet tea in mason jars. Men who had been eating institutional meals in various configurations for years stood in Eleanor Pemberton's side yard in the Texas spring and looked at the food and were quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when something simple is also overwhelming. Ernst stood near the smoker with a cup of sweet tea and watched. He watched a young German soldier named Wilhelm from Cologne, standing with a plate of brisket and eating slowly, eyes closed between each bite, in the same way Ernst had drunk the coffee on his first morning in the kitchen. He watched Hank Dobbs sitting on the fence rail, talking to one of the prisoners in broken German, while the prisoner talked back in broken English, and both of them laughed at the same moments despite understanding less than half of what the other said. He watched Eleanor moving through the yard with the efficiency of a woman in her own space, refilling things, checking things, providing without drawing attention to the providing. He walked to where Ray was standing at the far edge of the yard, away from the main group, holding his own plate and looking at the peach trees that had finished blooming and were now thick with early green leaves. Ernst stood beside him. They were quiet for a while in the way they had become comfortable being quiet beside each other. Then Ernst said that he wanted Ray to know something. He said that when he went back to Germany, if there was a school to teach at, he was going to teach the way a teacher should teach, which meant teaching his students to look at the world with their own eyes, rather than with the eyes they had been handed. He said he had spent a year watching a country that nothing had prepared him for, and he had concluded that the most dangerous thing a person could be was incurious, willing to know only what they had already been told. Ray listened. Ernst said that Jimmy Calloway, based on everything Ray had said about him, sounded like a person who was not incurious. He said that seemed worth preserving in the world, the memory of a person like that a person like that made a difference even after they were gone, as long as someone who had known them kept showing what it looked like. Ray looked at the peach trees for a while. Then he said that was possibly the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about Jimmy, and that Jimmy would have been embarrassed by it and also pleased. Ernst said good. He said those were usually the things most worth saying. They ate their brisket in the afternoon light, with the smoke still drifting from the cooker and the horses watching from the corral, in the enormous Texas sky, doing nothing in particular except existing, which was more than enough. That night, Ray sat at the desk in his room and took out a piece of paper. He had written very few letters in his life. He had always found the expression of things on paper difficult, not because he lacked things to say, but because putting them into words felt like making a permanent record of an internal state that was not yet finished changing. But tonight he wrote. He wrote to Jimmy. He wrote that the war in Europe was over. He wrote that Jimmy was not there to know it, which was the central wrong fact of every day since December. He wrote about the farm detail and the Pemberton property and the barbecue that afternoon, the brisket and the pinto beans and the smoke that went low across the fields. He wrote about Eleanor and what she had told him about Thomas and the man in the clearing. He wrote about Ernst Vogel, the brown journal, the coordinates, the name. He wrote that he had stood outside a barracks in the dark in December with a rifle and had come very close to doing something that would have made him into a different person than he wanted to be, and that he had not done it, and that he was not entirely sure he deserved credit for not doing it, since he was not sure the credit belonged to virtue rather than to a memory of their father in a fence post. He wrote that Ernst was going back to Germany in a few weeks. He wrote that he did not know whether what existed between him and Ernst was friendship. He did not know whether friendship was a category that applied across the specific distance of what had happened. But he wrote that something existed, something that had no comfortable name, something built from the particular materials of shared proximity and disclosed truth, and two people in different kinds of pain, deciding not to make each other's pain worse. He wrote that he thought Jimmy would have understood that. He wrote that Jimmy was always better at understanding those kinds of things than Ray was, and that this was still the case and that Ray intended to keep trying. He folded the letter and sealed it into an envelope. He did not address it. There was no address to put. He put it in his left breast pocket alongside the death notice, and the weight of both of them together felt for the first time like something he could carry without it being purely a burden. July came. The repatriation process began. Ernst Vogel was on the first list. No reason to delay, no security concerns. A former school teacher with a clean disciplinary record and a notation in his file that read no issues. Ray had signed off on the notation himself. The evening before Ernst's transport left, he found Ray in the administration corridor and asked if he had a minute. Ray said yes. They went outside and stood in the last light of the July evening, the heat still radiating up from the ground, even as the sky began to dim the summer in full authority over everything. Ernst reached into his coat pocket and took out a small object. He placed it in Ray's hand. It was a piece of wood, about the size of a palm, carved into the shape of a pine tree. The needles suggested, in careful parallel lines, the trunk tapering from the base. The wood was smooth from weeks of handling. It was oak from a scrap piece he had found in the carpentry area of the camp. and he had carved it in the evenings over 3 months. 3 failed attempts before this one, the first three, not right in some way, he could not fully articulate until the fourth one resolved into the correct shape. He said he did not know whether it meant anything to Ray. He said to him that it meant he had stayed long enough to finish something, that the act of finishing it had been important to him in a way he found difficult to explain, but that had something to do with the difference between a person who is simply waiting to leave and a person who is present in the place where they are. Ray held a small, carved pine in his hand. It was lighter than he expected. The surface was carefully worked smooth as riverstone, the lines of the needles precise in the way of something made by a person who was trained to be precise with language and had redirected that precision into his hands. He said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Ernst what he intended to do when he got back. Ernst said he would teach, if a school remained. If people wanted to be taught by someone who had spent a year in an American prison camp in Texas, he said there was a reasonable chance they did not. He said he was going to try anyway. Ray said that was the right answer. Ernst turned to go. He stopped. He did not turn back. He said facing the fence and the road beyond it, and the flat, dark land stretching north toward places neither of them had been, that he was going to say Jimmy Calloway's name to himself every November 25th for the rest of his life, that it was not penance and it was not performance. It was simply that some names should be held, and this was one of them, and he was going to hold it. Ray stood with the carved pine in his palm. He pressed his fingers around it. He said nothing. There was nothing he trusted himself to say that would not be less than what the moment required. Ernst walked away. Down the corridor of barracks in the July dark, not quickly, with the measured pace of a man who has somewhere to go and is not running from where he has been. Ray stood in the yard until the sound of Ernst's footsteps faded. Then he reached into his left breast pocket with his right hand. He took out the envelope with Jimmy's letter inside. He held the carved pine in his left hand. He stood there with one thing in each hand, a letter and a small wooden tree, both of them carrying the weight of things that had no other available container. He put the carved pine into his left breast pocket. He put Jimmy's letter in alongside it, both of them together. A small rectangle of grief and a small carved tree from an oak scrap in Robertson County, Texas. He walked back inside. Hank Dobbs watched the truck leave the next morning. He stood at the Colt fence as he often did in the peripheral position that had become his natural relationship to everything important he had witnessed at Camp Hearn. He watched the truck move down the camp road and turn north at the gate and disappear behind the line of mesquite that marked the edge of the property. He stood there until the dust settled. He was 20 years old. He had come to Camp Hearn not knowing anything except the categories he had been given. He was leaving knowing that the categories were insufficient and that the insufficiency was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be accepted, because the alternative forcing everything into categories that could not hold it produced the kind of damage he had watched Dieter Kranz produce from the inside of a closed system. He did not have words for most of what he had seen. He knew he would spend years finding them. What he had were images. A man drinking coffee in a kitchen with his eyes closed. A rifle lowered in the dark. A transfer order sitting unsigned in a tray for 2 weeks. A carved pine tree changing hands in a July evening. A man standing at a fence in the middle of a Texas spring saying something to another man that made both of them stand still for a long time. These were the things he would describe in later years when people asked him about the war. He would say he had not been to the front. He would say he had been in Texas at a camp. He would say that the most important things he had seen there were not dramatic in the way that war stories were supposed to be dramatic. He would say they were quiet. He would say they were the kind of quiet that accumulates over months and becomes eventually louder than anything. He would say in the particular way of a man who has spent decades finding the right words. The best person I ever knew was someone who never once thought of himself as good. He just kept doing the right thing in the dark when no one was watching and then went back to work. Munich, September of 1946. Ernst Vogel stood at the front of a classroom for the first time in 5 years. The school building was intact, which made it unusual in that part of the city. 23 children between the ages of 9 and 11 sat in rows that were slightly uneven because some of the desks were replacements salvaged from a building that had not been intact. He looked at them. 23 faces. The faces of children who had grown up during a war, who had learned to read in a country that was telling them one story while the world outside was telling them another, and who now sat in a classroom waiting to find out what a teacher thought they should know. He said good morning. He asked them their names. He listened to each name carefully, the way he had always done, because names were where you started if you intended to teach anyone anything real. In the third row, a boy with blonde hair and serious eyes raised his hand before Ernst had even assigned a question. The boy said his name was Klaus Berger, and he wanted to know whether it was true that the teacher had been to America. Ernst looked at him. He said yes, it was true. The boy asked what it was like. Ernst thought about this for a moment. He thought about Norfolk Harbor and the cranes, the train across 3 days of uninterrupted country, the flat light of Robertson County and the red soil and the enormous sky. Eleanor Pemberton's peach preserves in February, a cup of coffee in a camp kitchen at 6 in the morning with frost on the window. A carved pine tree sitting now on the shelf above his desk in the apartment he had rented with money borrowed from his sister. He said it was different from what he had been told. He said it was less like what he had feared and more like what he had been afraid to hope. He said the most important thing he had learned there was that a country and its people were never exactly the same thing, and that assuming otherwise was the source of most of the errors he had made in the first 25 years of his life. Klaus Berger nodded slowly in the way of a child absorbing something he plans to come back to. Ernst asked whether there were other questions. There were. There always were with 9-year-olds who had decided a teacher was someone they could trust to tell them the truth. He answered them one by one. He answered them carefully and completely and without condescension, because the children in front of him were going to grow up and make decisions that would shape the world that came after, and the least he could do was tell them what he actually knew. In the front pocket of his coat, beneath his jacket, against the left side of his chest, the small carved pine tree was present. It had been present in that pocket every day since July. It would continue to be present there for the next 4 decades through other classrooms and other students, in one marriage and 3 grandchildren, in the long, slow work of putting a country back together from the inside, which was the only direction from which such work could actually be done. On the shelf above his desk at home, beside the carved pine on the days he left it, there stood a glass jar of preserved peaches that Eleanor Pemberton had pressed into his hands the last day he came to the farm, saying nothing, just handing it over and going back inside, because that was how Eleanor communicated the things that mattered. He kept the jar for 30 years without opening it. The peaches turned dark and then darker, and eventually became something that was no longer really peaches, but was still in the way of preserved things exactly what they had been. On the 25th of November every year, Ernst Vogel said a name to himself, not out loud. In the quiet of wherever he happened to be at whatever hour of the day, the date turned over in the privacy of an internal act that no one else needed to witness or validate. He said it the way you say a thing that you have agreed to be responsible for, not as punishment, not as theater, as a kind of keeping. James A. Calloway, from Abilene, Texas, 24 years old, who should have seen the end of the war and did not. He said the name, and then he went on with his day. And in Abilene, Texas, on a farm that the Calloway family still worked, Ray Calloway spent those years the way a man spends years when the thing he survived has changed the shape of how he moves through the world. He did not talk about Camp Hearn in any particular detail. He did not tell the story the way stories are supposed to be told, with a clear beginning and a moral at the end. He kept a small carved pine tree in his left breast pocket until it wore a groove in the cloth, and then he kept it on the windowsill of the kitchen where the morning light came through and made the grain of the wood visible, and he looked at it most mornings while he drank his coffee without identifying to himself or anyone else exactly what it was that he was seeing when he looked at it. He knew. He simply did not have the words for it, and unlike Jimmy, he had never found the acquisition of words to be a thing that came easily. But there are things that do not require words. There is a photograph, small, black and white, taken in the summer of 1975 in a military cemetery in Normandy, France. A man stands before a grave. Silver-haired now, the lines of age settled into a face that has always been given more to observation than to display. He is not crying. He is standing the way a person stands when they have carried something a long time and come a great distance to do the carrying in the right place. He stands for several minutes. The June light moves across the white stones in the row. The grass is immaculate the way it always is in these places tended by people who understand that the tending is itself a form of respect. Then he straightens. He lays his hand flat on top of the stone for a moment, just for a moment. The stone is warm from the sun. He turns and walks away through the rows of graves in the summer light, stepping carefully, not hurrying, a 57-year-old man from Munich, who was once a school teacher and then a prisoner, and then a school teacher again, walking out of a cemetery in France with a carved wooden pine in his coat pocket and a jar of 30-year-old peaches on a shelf at home and a name he has said to himself on the same date every year for 3 decades. Behind him in the row he has left the stone reads James A. Calloway, Private First Class, United States Army, 1920 to 1944, Abilene, Texas. The June light is on it. The grass around it is green and precisely kept. The air over Normandy in summer smells of warm soil and sea wind, and from somewhere not far away, the faint sweetness of something flowering that has no name in any language Ernst Vogel was ever taught. He keeps walking. The cemetery is quiet behind him. The world is very large and still mostly unknown, which is he has come to believe exactly as it should be.